Good afternoon, everybody. Today we have with us Professor Sindhu Mathai. She's from Azim Premji University. She has been with APU since 2011. And today she's going to give an interesting talk on shifting landscapes of assessment in elementary, middle school education. Sorry. So she has wide teaching experience in assessment, and her research interests include graphical literacy, informal science education, gender and science. She has a background in science education, and she has received her PhD from the Homi Bhabha Center for Science Education in Mumbai. And her thesis was on visual spatial reasoning among middle school children. And what she didn't say in her bio is she is a very good artist, and her cubicle is filled with sketches and portraits. And we are very happy to have you here, Sindhu.
Good afternoon, everyone. Probably this may look like a strange topic here, I'm not sure, probably not. So I'm going to be talking about broadly the rationale for assessments and the large shifts that we are currently witnessing today in the way school education, right, is changing and is thinking about assessment. Then I will try to lay out some meaningful assessment reforms that were envisaged through the National Curriculum Framework 2005, which I'll talk about in a bit. And then after that, I will move on to talking about formative assessments that are used in the classroom, in the school classroom. Yeah, so we'll have to shift your landscape there first. And a few examples I would give as alternatives that have emerged to paper pencil, traditional or conventional paper pencil tests. Then the shifts that we've seen in these assessment reforms in the education of children with special needs is also a little bit that I will speak about. And then I'll conclude with some overall thoughts on the shifting landscapes in educational assessment. Okay, so I'll start with a cartoon strip. You could just look at it. Probably you've seen it. It's from an American cartoon strip called Tiger, which was actually most popular in the maybe 70s, 80s, a little, not so much now. So why I put this up here is to say that one of the large shifts that we are witnessing in assessment is the deep link that we've built between pedagogy and assessment, right? Assessment was seen as something very separate from the teaching process, right? I teach and then you're tested separately, or you're evaluated, and it's not necessary that both need to be matched, or I have to look at assessment as part of my pedagogy or my teaching learning process in the classroom. But the large shift that we are seeing now is away from this to saying that pedagogy, that is the teaching learning in the classroom, should be deeply linked to assessment. And assessment is not just trying to see what happens at the end of learning, but assessment can be for learning, right, or a part of one's learning. So what is really the rationale for assessments? As we all know, assessments are integral to the process of education. Why? Because education is an intentional endeavor, right? It has particular aims and objectives. And if we have to see if these objectives have been met, we need some kind of assessment. If we look at how assessments have evolved historically, they were used in the early 20th century primarily for selection and certification within the school system. Selection, of course, for filtering out people, and certification at the end of a program of study, which we are all quite familiar with. It's used even today. But then it was only for that. And we had the early IQ tests, which measured this fixed notion of intelligence, and it was used to classify and filter students for higher education and entry into particular professions. And certification, of course, has always been linked to some form of assessment. But then, however, we've seen large changing paradigms of assessment from the 1970s onwards. Started in the West with the various progressive education movements. In India, we've seen these trickle in more slowly, but it's definitely there. So from the 1970s onwards, we've shifted towards a broader understanding of assessment given what's called constructivist and interpretivist approaches, which is to say that this idea that knowledge is constructed, that we can't really look at an objective way of assessing students, that everything is interpreted in the classroom by the teacher, by students. So, of course, there are very radical forms of this as well, but there are also more nuanced understandings to say that we have to look at classrooms, we have to look at pedagogy before we look at assessment itself as an objective category. So how has it changed? That the big changes have been in enhancement of the learning for the child or student, not just as being evaluative alone, engagement with the student during the process of assessment, and engagement of teachers also with the assessment process, right? The evaluators also come with certain frameworks, biases, so we have to also look at that. So if you look at classroom assessment itself, it can be contrasted with large-scale assessments. I think we have a talk on large-scale assessments in a couple of weeks, so perhaps that speaker would lay out a lot of that as well. So in this talk, I won't get into large-scale assessments that, like you have the international, students' assessment of science and mathematics, PISA, TIMSS, and in India we have the ASR evaluations which are done and the NAS surveys which are done. So I won't get into all of those. But if you look at classroom assessment itself, which is the focus of my talk, it can to some extent be contrasted with large-scale assessments. Why? Because one of the main things is the reliability that we're looking at, right? High reliability is often not so critical in classroom assessments as much as in large-scale assessments. However, high validity should be there and is very meaningful. Now that's something I'll talk about a little more later. So teachers should use tests to scaffold students to perform at their best rather than fit them into a typical kind of performance. So traditionally we've tried to grade according to the curve and see that if we have a class of about 30 or so, we should be able to see that variation as per a normal curve. But the current understanding is that we shouldn't try and fit students into these categories, that we should try and scaffold, especially in the elementary school classroom, to scaffold children to be able to perform at what they are capable of performing from where they are at this point, rather than trying to see how they fit in with our normalized understanding. And this is a quote from the National Focus Group on Examination Reforms, which was an outcome of the National Curriculum Framework, which was our large document which we came out with in 2005. A sensitive teacher usually picks up the unique strengths and weaknesses of students. One should utilize her insight and assessment and empower her by empowering the system of internal assessment. So one has to give that enough weightage, also considering this newer paradigm of looking at learning of the child being very central. So just to give you an overview of what have been some of the assessment reforms we've witnessed post National Curriculum Framework 2005, regarding examinations, because our testing system has also been largely driven by examinations for a long period of time, and we are also looking at other ways of testing students now, and that's been largely an outcome of the National Curriculum Framework 2005. So examinations could be considered inappropriate given the shift towards assessment reform. It does not serve the needs of social justice because it's this assumption that one size fits all may not be appropriate to different kinds of learners. Uses question papers of questionable quality. If we look at our board exam papers, and largely there's a lot of questionable quality there. Induces an inordinate amount of anxiety and stress in students, and that's something that one has to take into account, especially considering the high stakes nature of many of our our assessments, even just school assessments. There's also a lack of transparency in the grading process. It's taking the place of reliable school-based assessments. And there's also a kind of missing of the forest for the trees, which is that we adhere to a lot of nitty-gritties of the textbook in not looking at the larger picture of where really the child is and how a child has actually performed. So some recommendations based on the National Curriculum Framework: a focus on question setting rather than paper setting, a lot of focus on what kinds of questions are asked, application-based questions, a shift to well-designed MCQs or multiple choice questions over mostly recall-based answer questions. And of course, a big change that came about as a result of NCF 2005 has been this need to eliminate failed as a terminology in both report cards, as well as the reform that we saw through the Right to Education Act, which brought in the no-detention policy, that students should not be failed between the ages of 6 and 14. Of course, we are seeing a lot of reviewing of this in the new education policy. I'll mention that towards the end, what are the changes we are seeing. But since it's still in the draft stage, the new education policy that we are witnessing now, This is still holds true. This still holds true that one should not be failing the students, and the idea being that the system should be able to take on the onus for the child not doing well, rather than put that pressure and onus completely on a small child who is just entering that whole process of education. So fail to be replaced by qualitative comments such as unsatisfactory and needs more work to attain expected standards. And so some kind of qualitative feedback which can help the child to be able to understand where do I need to improve, where have I not done well. And use of grades converted from marks. Again, the idea is that marks tend to differentiate one student from the other with just a few points, and probably a grade would therefore give a broad sense of what is the quality or what kind of performance the student has come up with. And of course, another reform has been a more complex, better perceived and valued report card over a typical quantitative a report card with marks alone as a measure. Of course, we've seen a lot more changes as a result of NCF 2005, better designed textbooks, at least in the primary level. Middle school, also one has seen large reforms, right? A lot of interesting questions which are child-friendly, visually interesting, have context, and also get the child to think and explore beyond the immediate rote learning or recall of rote learned material or information. So therefore, we have seen good textbooks, particularly in environmental studies and math at the primary level, as an outcome of some of these initiatives that NCF 2005 proposed. Another change that we have witnessed as a result of NCF 2005 is the assessment of what are called co-scholastic areas, areas which have been traditionally or conventionally not assessed because it's difficult to assess them, right? Such as life skills, which comprises of thinking skills, self-awareness, problem solving, decision making, social skills, which are deemed to be desirable but difficult to assess in a conventional classroom. So these include interpersonal relationships, communication, empathy. So this has been to some extent addressed through a range of alternative assessments which have been proposed, right? So through a simple test or a paper pencil test, it's difficult to assess these attributes. And therefore, a whole range of formative assessment practices which are alternative to conventional paper pencil tests have been proposed in the NCF 2005, as well as different manuals that NCERT came up with to help teachers understand how to use this in the classroom. So attitudes and values, and then creative, aesthetic skills, performing arts, and different kinds of what we would call extracurricular activities, and now in the realm of co-curricular activities, which are also meaningfully assessed, along with the scholastic areas, which are our subjects, which are anyway assessed and have been continue to be assessed. But then what has actually happened? So long I was talking about the whole range of assessment reforms. Many of them can be very far-reaching if we look at the spirit of what the intention has been. But instead, what we have seen are repercussions which have been contrary to what the document, the policy actually envisaged, right? Both in terms of the no-detention policy as well as the assessment reforms that NCF 2005 imagined. For example, I'll give you a few examples here. So when NCF 2005 talks of different strategies to use formative assessment in the classroom and assessments which are alternative to conventional paper pencil tests, they imagined that these would actually be used in the classroom. For example, a teacher making careful observations in class of a meaningful classroom activity that she has organized, right? Like getting children to work in groups, thinking about a question, pursue an inquiry in science, making certain observations, being able to come up with some kind of inference, right? So this is good pedagogy, but this is also pedagogy which lends itself to meaningful assessment without there being a separate sweat towards assessment, because there is documentation of work where the child is doing work, right? There are observations that the child makes. Then there is group work that's happening, which means children are given specific roles in the classroom. And there's all kinds of documentation that the children do meaningfully in the classroom, which can also be assessed as part of internal assessment or formative assessment. So NCF specifically says that it is advised that within each term, schools use the paper pencil test only once for assessing student performance under formative assessment. Please make use of other kinds of assessments such as anecdotal records of what is happening in class, or a particular incident where the child is displaying some unique, has taken some initiative, or has done some very interesting research work, or is able to come up with a contraption maybe for to answer a question or verify a hypothesis. But what has actually happened is we have now a number of tests being given in schools in the name of formative assessment. So you have multiple, so there's an FA1, FA2, right? And all of these are usually just tests again. But the idea behind the comprehensive and continuous evaluation was to make use of what is already happening in the classroom as good pedagogy, to also contribute to meaningful assessment of the child, and also gives valuable feedback to the teacher to change his or her classroom processes if necessary, and to see how to move ahead for that particular child, right? But instead we've witnessed a string of assessments which are again paper pencil tests or are traditional exams. Yeah, so this is actually the kind of those of you who are familiar with the kinds of assessments in CBSE schools, right? This is very familiar in the report card. You have the FA1, FA2. Yeah, you have a question? Yeah. Yes. Yes. Hmm.
It's related to just not understanding how to do cognitive assessment, or it is just time pressure that
Combination of both. Yeah, combination of both, because but actually the second the idea of time pressure, which is a popular kind of response, may not be completely true, because the idea of formative assessment is that it's integrated with your classroom pedagogy. Yeah, I should be standing on this side. Yeah. Okay, so integrated with classroom pedagogy. So therefore, the teacher doesn't have to take out separate time to assess the students, right? So if I've given the child a project to do, then the project is expected to also contribute to the child's learning. But then the output of that project, which is some written work, documentation, some exploration or activity the child does, library work, field trips, if there. So all of this contributes to the child's internal assessment. But then if you are looking at it as something separate, which is the traditional notion of assessment as being separate from the teaching learning process, then yes, it becomes cumbersome. So probably that's the interpretation, that it should be separate. Now a test usually is a separate activity. One gives it out, hands out a test after you do teach a particular topic. But this is envisaged to be not separate. Yeah, so that way, yes. The first aspect that you said is also very critical, because while all of these reforms have very far-reaching implications, so many years, 15 years down the line, we've not seen the kinds of implications we could have witnessed because of the hand-holding that is needed actually, and has not been, is not sufficient given our mass education system and the scale at which we need to work. We have not really seen those reforms percolating into the system. So that's definitely a challenge as well. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Yes, yes. In fact, yeah, that's also an important point what you said. I mean, traditionally our notion of assessment as being covert overt, right? That you're actually, explicitly saying that this is your question paper, now but there are many ways in which it has become, it is part of the process, and that also gives meaningful feedback for the teacher as well, right? How am I doing in class? Yeah, so that's a big shift, a conceptual shift that one has to make in one's understanding itself of assessment, right? Then one doesn't look at it as something being, yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah, so, yeah.
Taken up over me. That we only wanted to review this project.
Okay. Hmm.
So children end up doing the project, and instead of the teacher watching what is happening, how
Yes.
they are doing the project,
Yes.
the only person who seems to be watching them is the school.
Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly what they do. The teachers have no clue.
Yes. Yes, so that's probably another implication on time, for instance. So all of this has to be structured to where it is linked to the goals, the objectives of the assessment. So what are my objectives, and from there, what is it that I expect to see in students as if I need to fulfill those objectives. Now, if that is not clearly laid out, then clearly it is it's open. It can be interpreted multiple ways. It may become a meaningless exercise, as you yeah. So the idea of assessment being invariably the teacher having to go back to what is my objective now? Why am I doing this? And what do I want to see in students as a result of their learning? That I feel that the objective has been achieved. So if that has to happen, then it will be structured in a way that I'm trying to see what is the competency I'm trying to achieve, what is my pedagogy doing to help me achieve that, and what is the behavior or what is it that the student needs to produce to be able to. So that congruence actually, as you're saying, is largely missing. It probably requires a lot of teachers' time as well to be able to structure it that way. In fact, certain curricula in schools have also become popular because they have structured it for the teacher, right? I mean, so that's another reason why you see. So, for instance, though we've had good textbooks come out of the National Curriculum Framework 2005, you notice that several schools are not using these textbooks. Of course, at the 10th, 12th, the board exam level, you have to use it, no choice. But if you see, by and large, they use what is available in the local market or among private publishers. Why? Not because they are better books, but because they lay out explicitly what the teacher needs to do in the classroom. What are the objectives? What is it that I have to teach? This is my lesson plan, also laid out for you. How much time? How do I assess the child? So all of that is written out, and that is why these curricula have also become popular, right? So that's also a strange thing that has happened, in to accommodate this ease of doing things in class, and also the fact that if a teacher leaves in the middle of the year, or or there is some, or if you don't have enough teachers, then it's easy for another new teacher to come up, pick up a book and see how to go about it and just do it in the class, which is another unfortunate aspect that has, yeah. So yeah, that's. Then, of course, also the fallout of the no detention policy. The no detention policy, as it was envisaged, as I just mentioned, was to look at the burden of doing well as not just the child's burden, but the burden of the system to make sure that the child does well, achieves progress, attains the competencies required. But unfortunately, it has also slipped into, has had repercussions contrary to what one imagined. So there are also radical views looking at assessment as further debilitating already disadvantaged students, because we know that there is a large role that the home environment plays, that informal experiences play in how a student does well in school. And given that, it is so there is actually an opposition also. There's a movement that opposes assessments in certain, of course, that's a radical kind of view, and therefore there are schools which don't take assessment seriously too, saying that it is only a matter of getting the child to the next class. Right? Now, what this has led to is all kinds of problems, the other side, right? That we don't try and see what really has a child learned, and are there large gaps then that tend to accumulate as a child progresses from one year to the next because of previous competencies not being achieved, or prerequisites not being achieved to move to the next level, right? And so there's a skewed focus, yeah, and we've also seen that the result of such an emphasis has been an urge to pass students without attempting to understand their learning with reference to expectations from a particular grade level, right? So this has also been quite rampant, and that's why our large-scale assessments show that learning outcomes have not improved as much as we would have liked them to improve over the years, despite all these reforms having come in. Yeah. Yes.
Yes, that time, even I don't know my so my class will be but now it has to be fine. So no matter what you have done, probably yeah, you pick up a few on the
but may not reach the level even average. So you say with this particular policy take into account, okay, probably the student is not doing maybe math is not the one trying to make the solution.
Yes.
So if they assessment detect the student's intrinsic capabilities.
So the idea, if you look at the spirit of it, it was exactly that all students progress at a different pace, especially at that critical age group, but over a period of time, over some years, they catch up if given the necessary inputs, and probably they do better in one subject over their peers compared to. So there is time available. But then what has happened is that there hasn't been this understanding of where really is this child, right? Because of this tendency to just pass students, because the no detention policy says you cannot hold back. And that has led to students not performing and not being given the required inputs to reach the level they need to, even if it doesn't happen in that class. So they can achieve that level even if they're supposed to achieve grade 7 competencies, they can achieve it in grade 8. This policy gives them that provision. But that has to be supported by inputs from the system. But if those inputs haven't come in, then the child is at a loss. So what has happened simplistically is that those inputs haven't been given, and therefore children get to age 14 with these large gaps, and then when they get to 15 years, they notice the no detention policy is not there to save them, and that's when they land up failing. Yeah.
Are there systems here? Which, for example, let's say, okay, this student is
That the student is?
mathematics.
Yeah.
Who would have failed in every subject.
Yes.
Like that. So are there any? But in maths,
Yeah, so if the student doesn't get through all subjects in 10th, that's still, so that holds back. I don't think much has changed, except if you have a sensitive teacher there who's able to, but even then the system will take over, saying that, you have not cleared the other subjects. So that remains actually a question. Yeah.
The idea of allowing a direct progress that fundamentally inconsistent with this whole notion of everybody progressing from class N to class N plus 1 year on year.
Yeah. Yeah, true. Yeah, true. It is actually.
You have a system like this where you have timed progression
Yes.
from one level to another. You simply cannot have different progression at their own pace.
Yes. No, you're right, actually. That's been pointed out also as a critique of this, right? That logically you want students to progress from one stage, and then you are saying that, let them take their. So who is taking the onus of giving them that extra support to be able to reach that level, even if it's a little delayed? So currently we are going through this phase of review of the no detention policy, the new education policy that the draft is out. I'll talk about it at the end, probably, because it's still in the draft stage. I don't want to comment on it, but there is definitely a review of the no detention policy happening now, saying that the intentions with which the policy was proposed does not seem to have been matched by improved learning outcomes. Of course, there's lesser stress on the child, but at what cost when the child gets to high school? So so it's currently being reviewed. Probably it may go off too. That's what we, yeah. So now let me look at some of the positive aspects of what has actually worked in the classroom as a result of many assessment reforms that we have seen, which is that we have now a whole toolkit, various kinds of assessment practices, a multiplicity of practices that teachers are trying and using in the classroom. Now, one can't really say about the success of all of these in that sense, measurable as learning outcomes, but there is definitely a move towards using much more than the conventional tests alone. So, for instance, differentiated assessments, right? So, differentiated assessments, of course, would mean that children in even the same grade would be working at different levels depending on where the child is, right? Which is not to say that it's not the same as saying that some children are held back and some children progress later, but it is to say that they are assessed a bit differently, right? Even when they are working at the same age group, right? So, or working with the same age group of children. Or one could also have systems where you have a mixed age group, like you have Nalikali in Karnataka, where you have class 1 to 3 working together as a group in government schools. And of course, in several alternative schools, also you have the mixed age format, where you have children of comparable grades in a comparable stage. So not to say that you put together a first grade child with an 8th grade child, but a primary group or a middle school group together, but working at differentiated levels depending on, so the same activity being differentiated into different levels depending on the age group of the child and the stage at which the child needs to work with, and of course curricular requirements. So use of modified assessments in the classroom depending on the learning level of each child, even if they are grouped within the same grade, and based on the rationale again that each child progresses at his or her own pace, but eventually achieves the expected competencies. Now, this is not to say the expected competencies are achieved later, but it is to say it can happen within that year itself. This has been used in the primary years. It has been experimented on a large scale, and it has its pros and cons. So even Nalikali is going through the process of review. The good thing has been that children work together in groups. There's a lot of peer learning that happens. The teacher is really a facilitator there in the classroom. And the onus has shifted to students making sense of their own learning, trying to see how they have progressed in the course of a year by trying to look at their own assessments. So therefore we've seen good shifts. But the other side is that there are certain competencies that are missing, right? Learning to, for instance, write well, reading and writing, the traditional competencies which one expects, that has probably gone down. So there's a rethinking there as well. And there are also, and this comes in, differentiated assessments come in handy when you're viewing more complex assignments such as projects, constructing arguments based on reading texts at the higher classes, etc. So it has its own advantages there. Rubrics for more messy assignments such as projects. So rubrics typically we use at the higher education level for grading assignments and things like that. These are also can also be used in the school level, again NCF gives examples of rubrics that can be used for little more non-traditional assessments, such as giving an experimental task to children and then assessing them based on how well they have done that experiment. It's also useful because it clarifies teachers' expectations from a student assignment. So I'll give probably an example this is from the NCERT source book for teachers, and this is a rubric for a lab activity, a practical lab activity. Of course, we are quite familiar with this, but this is something that the teacher will now not just let the students do an active experiment and just ask the student to come up with some observations and finish, right? Or probably just write up a lab journal which is copied from the guide, right? That's given. But it is to say that the teacher actually observes the child doing the activity in a group and tries to assess how the child is setting up the experiment, whether the child uses appropriate techniques to perform the experiment, how is the child collecting data, irrespective of whether the value is correct or not, works with precision, neatness, accuracy, interprets data observations, and draws inferences, relates the findings with theoretical knowledge, because often both these are kept separate, and that's always been a bane of our practicals, that the theory and the practical is always a separate activity, and also demonstrates some understanding during the viva, right? So this is a simpler kind of. More complex rubrics are also there, where you would actually differentiate score of, if there is, if you say a mark from 1 to 5, then what really does 1 mean, what does 2 mean, right? At the higher level, we will try and grade that accordingly. At the school level, it is a little more simpler, where you just say, okay, you have a broad idea of what is 1, what is 2, right? And within that, another interesting kind of formative assessment practice is to look at questions in the classroom, right? To try and, so there's been some work in this direction too. What kinds of questions are being asked by the teacher in the classroom, and what kinds of questions are students also asking in the classroom, and how can that be a reflection of what kind of learning is happening, and how can that also be used as a way of assessing students' meaning making, right? Of course, now not to say that all of these are complete by themselves, but all of these can be inputs. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. I don't think I went through all of this. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah.
It looks like a lot of work for the teacher. You need to actually for every assessment that you
Yes. For every complex assessment. So, yeah.
have there been empirical studies of the effectiveness of using rubrics? Without rubrics, how different was it?
Yeah, so even I think who was mentioning it, I don't remember, probably you. Yeah, so this idea that if it is not structured, then you can't be, yeah, so for example, if we look at, I just realized I didn't go through all of these. So what is my expectation from a student's assignment is not clear. It may be there in my mind implicitly, but if I put it down as a rubric, it will save me time when I am assessing, because it is there, it is written up, right? Otherwise, it's an implicit notion of what is, what qualifies as a 4 or what qualifies as a 2 when it is between 1 and 5, right? So it actually saves time at the time of when you are evaluating a complex assignment. Now, in a test, it is, of course, you have a score, and based on the score probably you will convert to a grade, and there's a qualitative interpretation of that. But in a complex assignment such as a project where you have different stages, and then you have people working in a group, so there's group activity, so there's a possibility that only one child will do all the work in the group, which means probably you will need to allocate roles, and that role probably needs to rotate. And then within each stage of the assignment also, not every stage would be equally complex. So probably the experimental stage will be the most complex, but a hypothesis, probably every child can come up with some hypothesis. Then connecting it theoretically may be another. So what is the weightage that I give to each stage of my process? So that maybe in my mind is implicit, that clearly this phase takes more work.
Theory is so fun.
Yeah.
Have there been serious empirical studies to demonstrate that
It is clearly, yeah, I mean,
more consistent without rubrics?
there are, yeah.
Another concern is that I'm not sure the teachers who actually do the evaluation for the wrong actually convince the teachers to do the work. That it is worth their time to invest in.
Yeah, so for instance, rubrics like this, which is again given by NCRT as, and supposed to be used in CBSE schools, are simpler, because you have, okay, now what are the 5-6 things I want to look at? And of course, I don't have gradations listed down very clearly between 1 and 5, but I have a sense that, okay, this is what I want to look at. So one cannot expect teachers to be writing up very detailed rubrics, unlike at the higher level where you want, you probably also have the time to do that, maybe. Yeah, or maybe not, I don't know. But, but the idea that it's difficult, as you're saying, for teachers to do that. But then the absence of rubrics would mean that, one, it is the intended outcomes are not met then, and it's very complex, so you're likely to give it up in favor of an easier thing like a test, where it's simpler for you to assess than this. Yeah, so yeah, okay, I want to respond one, but probably I'll, yeah. This is to achieve certain objectives out of doing a lab activity. Yeah. For the student as well, because the student would also know now, so for instance, am I able to relate the findings with theoretical knowledge? So if I get a score of 3 on 5, then the teacher would also help me understand why is it that, where have I not done well, or why have I not got a 5, for instance. So where do I need to improve for the next time? Yes. The student can also, so I'll come to peer and self-evaluation, but this is something that the teacher develops. Now, we can also look at it as a peer environment, which I'll come to in a bit, probably then So it's possible to club the teacher's evaluation with the self and peer evaluation. That also sort of, in fact, that may be very meaningful for the child as well, I don't know if I answered your question, but yeah, so this idea that the absence of a rubric, I'm not sure if that will be Also, no, if the teacher has to see the benefits of it to be able to continue using a rubric. Once it's done. So those teachers who have used teaching learning in a constructive sense, who have tried other, other ways of teaching and learning and assessing students, once they see the benefits of it, that one, it is integrated with your teaching learning, that I don't have to, separately administer a test. And if my pedagogy is good and I land up with, again, a conventional test to assess students, there's a big mismatch between the way they are taught and learned and the way they are finally assessed. So once the teacher sees the value of it, then it becomes easier. But initial days, yes, it is very difficult. And of course, there are all kinds of systemic constraints, not to say that, all kinds of burdens on the teacher to do a lot of other work. And so one has to be empathetic to that reality as well. Yeah, that is, yes, yeah. Hmm. Yes. Hmm. 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 Yes. Yes. True. Hmm. Yes. Yes.
So, but if they're already overfitting to the
Hmm.
I have to do this only, then probably will never know the negative.
Yes. Yes.
Which also adds important.
Yes, yes, definitely. So if you look at, probably I've just pulled this out of somewhere, but if you look at, for instance, the assessment of co-scholastic aspects, right, which is also part of my assessment of the subject content of the child, right? So while I'm looking at a child setting up this activity, doing the experiment, I'm also assessing the co-scholastic aspects of how has the child been able to, handle an error or a mistake that the child has made and be able to rectify it or reflect on it or write up something on it, right? So these will count towards my co-scholastic aspects as well. So while I have taken this out, you should, I think, to be fair to this whole thing, it is only one part of a wide repertoire of assessments that a child has to go through, and that's why it's called comprehensive evaluation. But I'm not trying to justify everything in it, because as we know, there are all kinds of problems. And one of the problems could be that one can easily force fit it into a ritual and do it, and then everything becomes mechanical. Whatever, progressive element in it can also become mechanical. Yeah. Yeah. The same, yeah.
The same, can I modify it something like, okay, suppose you are not done with it, what problem?
Yes.
By each one of them,
Yeah.
you put the negation, not doing that.
Yeah.
So it's not discouraging you not to do,
Yes.
but positive.
Yes. Yeah. So if you look at the position paper that the NCF came up with on the teaching of science, it is that it is exactly what you are saying, that that typically our lab activities are, expect, right, a value, a particular result. There is a clear expectation there that it just becomes a, transferring a recipe into a kind of success formula. And it should not be the case when, particularly in science, where exploration and making mistakes, as you were saying, is very critical. Yeah. So, but then the idea is over here is to show that what you are doing in class can easily become part of your internal assessment. That's the idea. And one doesn't then need to worry about assessing separately. That would be, but your point is taken about, yeah. So. Okay, so moving on to a few more categories of assessments. Probably I'll go through this. If there are questions at the end, I could. So one is just looking at what kinds of questions are asked in the classroom. Right now, typically we say a good classroom involves questioning, the teacher asking meaningful questions, students also asking questions, that there should be some kind of dialogue that happens. So there's been all kinds of research categorizing what kinds of questions teachers ask, what kinds of questions students ask in the classroom. So the typical would be lower or higher order questions, the kind of understanding that is expected. But usually teachers would ask questions which make very low cognitive demands from students, right, which are highly procedural or transactional questions, very few conceptual or higher order questions, or questions which involve higher order thinking skills like forging comparisons or trying to do some problem solving or prompting some action from the student, right? So that's again been analyzed. So just an example from an article to show what is our typical traditional kind of classroom discourse, where there's a teacher who asks a question, the student responds, and the teacher says, okay, it is correct or wrong, and moves on to the right. So it is cut short at that point, and that's the typical kind of classroom discourse that we see around questions. But then there can be many other kinds of classroom questions. I won't get into great details, but this idea that a question should prompt a conversation with the student, right? So the student makes a statement, such as, so what do we do in this case? The student says we average the values, and then the teacher says, okay, we do that, but then can you explain what that means, right? How is this an appropriate thing to do? And how would you go about doing it? And then the student again elaborates, and there's probably a peer who will now counter that or add on to what the student says, right? So there is a conversation that goes on in class, and if again this is structured, it's possible that even this can be used as a way of formative assessment as well as feedback for the teacher on the pedagogy and how much the student has understood, right? Of course, it needs to be structured so that every student is involved. Typically, we have a few students in class who are asking all the questions and answering them, yeah, as well. So one has to make sure that if it has to be, if it has to be an assessment that can be used for all students in the class, then a little more structuring would need to be done, where probably, randomly there are, certain students who are asked questions so that everyone has a turn, or there's some selection of chits, or, some way of, equalizing.
All these things with respect to scale, right? How do we scale it? That is the biggest problem.
Yeah.
Even though it is there, conceptually it makes sense.
Yes.
We are not able to implement this because of the sheer scale. If you have 30, like if you have a student ratio of 1 is to
30.
5, we can do that. But 1 is to 500. It's not possible, right?
1 is to 500. So actually, in all our government schools, we notice there's a good ratio of 1 is to 30. In fact, at the private schools, you have all of these different, you have the high-end private schools which have gone to one extreme of 5 students, the other extreme of 50, right? But if you look at the government schools, the RTE norm is to have 1 is to 30. And I think most government schools have adhered to that. So you don't have any more of these. There are various problems there, not to say there aren't, but at least there's an expectation that you have a 1 is to 30 classroom size now. Yeah, and by and large that has been fairly, I think, been implemented across. Of course, you have a lot of deviations, and I agree with you that it becomes a problem, but a 30 class, I don't know. I mean, there are different positions on this. So yeah, probably my position would be that on the one hand, yes, you need a few students to be able to use a dialogue in the class, but then if you want to have class discussions, you need that critical group as well, right? So there are cons also of having a very small class, and the group work that is possible with a, not too large, but a 30 class, right, would be, yeah. But as you're saying, there are a lot of contextual constraints as well, yeah. Okay, peer assessment, probably have 10 more minutes, yeah, okay. So, just to sort of take off from your question as well, right? So this idea that peer assessment is meaningful because peer and self, one can look at both, because there is a metacognitive element that comes into the assessment. So a student just receiving marks or evaluation from the teacher, as opposed to the student thinking about, now how would I grade myself on this? There has to be a rubric in place for it. Again, this has to be structured. The teacher has to think through a rubric. It can be in collaboration with the students, develops it, does a few practice trials also in the classroom, and then gets students to use it, right? Because interpretation is also critical. So have children interpreted it the way, the class has decided it should be interpreted. And this peer assessment, along with teacher assessment, right? Not completely peer assessment or not a standalone peer assessment, but that when used along with teacher assessment, both complements the assessment in that the peers also have a say. So for example, in the lab activity, if there is some collaborative work and the teacher has probably seen only one part of it, the peer would also be aware of many other aspects that have happened in the lab while the teacher has not been observing. So all this comes into that interpretation. It leads to fairness in a certain sense. But particularly the important part is it is metacognitive for a child, because then a child is not a passive, receiver of the marks or evaluation that the teacher has handed down to him or her, that there is this thinking. And similarly, when I'm evaluating a peer as a student, then I'm also thinking about my own performance with respect to my peer. While it can be looked at as a comparison, the idea is it helps me understand, right? What is the expectation from a question like this or an assignment like this? So the metacognitive process is very important and comes into play during peer learning. Of course, in some cases with older children, and of course at the college level, one can also substitute it for teacher grading, again if it is handled very carefully, but that's difficult to do. It needs a lot of investment of time and practice and things like that. So that's, and the teacher has to be very clear about what are the interpretations for the different grades and things like that. So at the school level, it can be used along with teacher grading after sufficient practice and after a fair discussion on the different indicators and the rubric and how to go about it. Okay, yeah. Yes.
But maybe that one, for example, teachers, the 20 students, probably statistically only to be some students actually act maybe 5 or 4. It's like some students are actually.
Yes.
Now, can't those who are saying very good, extremely good, can they hand it over to some other teacher who specializes in
Like a gifted education sort of, okay.
other state of
Yeah, a special education program, yeah.
won't that take care of
Yeah, but one is talking of resources, human resources in terms of teachers who are qualified and competent to handle both the ends. Yeah, no, in terms of training and, so one is how many people do we have who are trained to handle, children who are gifted and trained to handle children with special needs. Yeah, yeah. So one needs appropriate training because very often we think that it can be interpreted as repetition, dealing with children with special needs, when we know that's not the case. Pedagogically itself, there has to be a change. Similarly, when one is dealing with gifted children, also, right, one needs to be at a level of being able to understand where the child is and how much scaffolding the child. So that kind of training and how many such trained people do we have is a question. But yeah, given the resources, yes, and definitely it would be individualized also then. Yeah. Oral assessments, yeah, I think we can imagine, yeah, we typically do use interviews, vivas, presentations, different kinds of oral conversations, and it also helps children with special needs because our assessments are all driven towards primarily written assessments. So involving an oral component brings in a different world, the world of practice, of communication, of being able to simplify your ideas, to be able to speak to a group, and that's also an important element of alternative assessments. And of course, it helps children who are not quite confident with written, not to say that they can do away with the written, but it brings one more component where they're able to do better than in the written mode. Then of course we also have different uses of non-verbal testing, non-verbal as opposed to verbal, which can be use of gestures, visual representations in the classroom, getting children to draw and make meaning. Again, cannot be used for all topics and all subjects, but to say that this can be one of the modes that can be used. Of course, it has advantages not only for children who have a facility with the visual over the verbal, but also to say that it tests different kinds of skills, simultaneity, systemic processing, as opposed to step-by-step or linear kind of processing, and it's also something that children typically take to in their early years well, and it's also friendly in that sense. So therefore that's also an important part of testing. It could take on other forms, not only visual representations, but also drama, music, using haptic manipulation manipulative such as games, which so use of that in the particularly in the primary years, it can be used well, and if observed carefully, children can be assessed also using these forms. Okay, so I'll just move on. Yeah, yeah, this one, yeah. Yes. Yes.
Now, I'm sure for them, there will be some other than
Yes, yes, definitely. So all of these have their own. Yes, yes.
they can interpret the visuals in terms of all types.
Yes, yes. So yeah, so the visual can be there's a whole range over there from your equations which are almost like written language to the complex photographs of the real world. So there's a whole range over there, and depending on yeah, definitely a child who is visually impaired cannot be assessed using this form. But the idea is that you have all of these different forms so that one they complement helps you understand and for the child also to use different kinds of ways of expressing understanding, and also that some may be better for some students over others. So there are equal advantages in that sense, right? That written may be good for some, and so that's the idea, that there's this toolkit, but not to say that we use only one over the other. Yeah, that otherwise that would be a yeah. So okay, I'll just make a few statements about how all of these different approaches that we have seen regarding formative assessments have led to different ways of diagnostic testing, right? Looking at what are children's abilities, what kind of help they need, and remedial education programs. All of this has been possible because we have a whole range of ways of testing students compared to the classic or conventional paper pencil test, right? And now we have, in fact, this is prepared by the SCRT. We have, depending on the category of disability, you have approaches, right? Tips and suggestions for the teacher in the classroom, TLMs or teaching learning materials that can be used, and accommodations or adaptations for children depending on the kind of disability they have, right? So using a repertoire of assessment techniques besides paper pencil tests have also led to this. This has been a big contributor to the growing area of understanding that every child is different, that some children may have maybe exceptional, some children may need special remedial kind of instruction, and everyone has their own strengths and weaknesses, and to be able to diagnose even and to anchor one's pedagogy and assessment around that, we need to be able to use a wide variety of techniques. Only then can we use it meaningfully in the classroom. So for example, TLMs for physical disabilities, right? There are all kinds of suggestions that are given in teachers' books, and also how the curriculum can be adapted to cater to children who have particular handicaps, in this case physical disabilities, but there are all kinds of cognitive disabilities also that are mentioned in source books accordingly. So some concluding remarks on the new education policy that's currently in the public domain, and it's also being revised because there are suggestions that have come in from various people, and it's we should have the final document soon, right? So some of the changes that further shifts that we are going to be seeing is a big review of the continuous and comprehensive evaluation and the no detention policy to ensure that while all of this has led to child-friendly approaches and practices, how do we also make sure that learning outcomes are also achieved, right? So that's still a big question. And there's also now a suggestion there to move to make board examinations also formative in nature, rather than make it very high stakes, one-off and summative alone. So multiple, and also with multiple possibilities for children to take them. So multiple board exams, which means that you can take it at different times. You don't have to wait for this one big board exam that will determine a lot of things and will also fail you probably. But it could be taken at different times and also at different classes. While it also sounds a bit stressful to listen to all of this, it's also in spirit the idea that the board exams should also become formative in nature, because it is formative assessments that really give feedback to the child and also reduce the stress on both the teacher as well as the children. And computer-based adaptive testing to be also made possible instead of handwritten board examinations. Administration becomes easier. There's also individualized and accurate feedback, but of course we still have a long way to go to reach there if we want to replace board exams with computer-based adaptive testing. So to just conclude, so we have certainly made various shifts in our ways of looking at assessment, starting from looking at assessment as only tests and exams, as separate from pedagogy, as requiring different, as something separate from the classroom process, to looking at it being very central to the classroom process, to be looking at it as central to the teaching learning practices that a teacher adopts. And the engagement of the student in the process is also very critical now, rather than looking at the student as someone who just comes to take the tests and is assessed for his or her learning. We've also seen various systemic reforms as envisaged by the NC of 2005, but we still have to see the percolation of these practices on scale. Now, that's been still a challenge, though there are very far-reaching consequences that one can imagine if all of this is put into practice and actually reaches. And of course, we may have further shifts with the new education, the policy that is now in the draft form and will soon be there. However, what has been tangible and remarkable are the huge gains we have made in developing diagnostic testing and individualized education programs for children with special needs, of course, but questions of equity and access still remain. How much of this is accessible to children from different socioeconomic backgrounds, and whether they are able to access this, right? So that still remains a question, but there have been large strides that have been made in that direction because of the variety of assessments and of course this idea that pedagogy and assessment are deeply linked. Yeah. Okay, so I'll stop with this, and these are some references. Yeah. Thank you. Yes.
Many of the at the end of the year, the teachers are given limited time to look at the system. So they are not able to gauge the complete the scale of how the things are being done by students. Okay. Practically.
Yes.
So how does that come into picture in this particular process?
Yeah, true. So, so NCF actually has a whole focus group position paper on examination reforms, which is quite interesting to read. Some of their key recommendations have been that that one, we have to focus on well-designed multiple choice questions. Why? Because one, there is transparency in evaluation there. At the same time, if it is well-designed, it is also friendly to the student, because the expectations also, right, become clear. That we try and eliminate short answer questions, because they are on this vague, so, you know, we are not very clear, right, how much is expected and what really is a learning advantage over there. But then good essays, right, because only through essays can we build argument and structure in writing, right? So one has to give emphasis to essays, and of course they have to be carefully structured. There should be a rubric to be able to evaluate it. I'm not sure if we've gone that far, but at least well-designed MCQs to take the place of you know, large amount of these short assessments, and also the transparency in evaluation that it provides. Yeah. So, but yeah, it still remains a challenge. Not to say that we've, yeah, that really evaluation is a challenge, and when you have to evaluate a large number of papers and follow a scheme, it can easily slip into, because examiners also come with a certain framework and bias. I don't know, everything else contextual. Yeah. So yeah, that remains. Yeah.
So in this entire line of discussion, there is this missing acceptance of the fact that just like education, assessment is also participating in nature.
Yes.
And it requires the appreciation of the students to measure.
Yes.
And the assessment is for them, for their own benefit.
Yes, definitely.
put them in a grade of grade scale, but for their own self-assessment.
Yes, yes. In fact, that's very central to this whole thing, right? So this, yeah.
I'm talking about higher education.
Yes.
Scenario. Yes. I'm sure this would be more pronounced in elementary education.
Yes, yes, definitely.
The students are completely unaware that assessment is something that they are equally part of, and it often becomes, instead of a collaborative game, turns into an adversarial game where it is used against the instructor.
Yes.
For example, suppose during the lecture, I asked a large number of questions throughout the lecture. Again, as you rightly pointed out, there is a very minuscule portion of the class who even consider it appropriate
Worthy, yeah.
that they should respond.
Yes, yes, yes.
Most of them think that it is their right or duty to sit
Passive.
completely passive. And if you make an eye contact with them, they give a shock look, so why are you looking at me?
Okay, yeah.
I'm talking about graduate.
Yes, yes. Yeah.
Graduate level students. What to say about school students? So this is one of the things that is there. On the other hand, the more participative we make in assessment, the more intangible it is likely to become. But when we are doing assessment, we are also supposed to make some sort of record of what we are doing.
Yes.
Which means that makes us gravitate towards more and more written forms of assessment. So that also is one of the problems. So among many problems, these are two what I wanted your opinion.
Yes, yes, definitely. So as I pointed out even in the first slide, I mean the big shift that we have made is, and given constructivism and interpretivism, this idea that that there is a large role that context plays, and given that it's important to understand the student's engagement with the process, the teacher's view, right, and how enmeshed is pedagogy and assessment rather than keeping it separate. So yeah, I would agree with you on both the points that you made, that it's important to break that, to discuss that in the classroom, but also that sometimes liberal pedagogies and assessments can be counterproductive also, right? That all students may not be able to understand what freedom and choice and autonomy means in the classroom. And therefore, a fair idea of accountability and expectations, clearly lay down expectations, is also very critical because it doesn't work for all students. So that's also important to understand. That's what we have seen from all these reforms, Nalikali. Even this review of no detention policy that's happening, the continuous and comprehensive evaluation, all of these in spirit we are in agreement with, right? Nobody would doubt that. But in practice, what has happened, the failure has been primarily that that it is not perceived and understood similarly by everyone, and therefore one needs a certain kind of accountability there to be able to make it work in practice for all students. So that is also to be borne. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Yeah.
Would it be helpful to, every now and then, apply to the students of the spirit of the assessment?
And teachers, yeah. In fact, a large amount of success could be achieved if the teachers are with the whole system, right? Because they are the drivers there. So yes, the teacher should be doing that, but the teacher herself should be convinced that this is not a series of tests to be done, monotonous, multiple tests. I had just one term and now I have many in the view of, good and meaningful assessments. Why, right? So, and do I have to really do tests? Can there be other ways? But yeah, if we've got the teacher on board, but of course the teacher is also an individual with all of these, yeah, so it's complex, but yeah, that would certainly help that discussion. Yeah, you had a, yeah. Yeah.
I'm supposed to carry a grade which is going to decide whatever I do later with Prof. All of this looks pretty ideal.
Yes.
The moment I have to carry this thing called grade or a number or something, obviously all comparisons will come to somebody has to decide why I got H and not the extra confidence.
Yes. Yeah, I mean,
If you say
hmm,
we are doing evaluation essentially for the pedagogy for
hmm, learning.
deciding what the
Yeah.
child should learn next,
Yes. Yes.
then I mean that shouldn't be a mill around my neck which I need to
Hmm.
carry around over the time.
Yeah. Yeah.
The moment you make it that, then I think the whole purpose will
Yeah. Yes, yes. So we've seen now this has been used in schools, started with CBSE, now also part of state boards, in several state boards, including Karnataka. So it's been some time that we've been trying these things. We've seen that there are successful, schools where they are able to implement it. Of course, it's not just that individual teacher, it's that whole system that's working to support her, the school system, the principal, the teacher network. Yeah, yeah, true, true.
see how do I convince the parents why their child failed whereas the neighbor's child got it right? The easiest way to do that is to show a piece of paper saying, look, this person got 0, that person got 2. How do you bring them into the picture? Unless you utter that, a lot of
No, in fact, the report card that
RTI and all that.
yeah, so the report card that this kind of CCE imagines is much more complex. It is informative. So one needs to actually sit with the parents, but there's much more there than the marks. Yeah, yeah. On board. Yeah, yeah. True. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, yeah, yeah. At the school level, it is. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. True. Yeah.
Which school level impact what we carry through, right? See, one way, then there are attempts to reduce the impact of, for example, nobody is looking at the 10th grade, 10th class mark sheet, right? So at multiple levels, people are saying that, okay, that is good enough to judge whether you are passed or whatever, right? So, but it is not being used any further. It's only attempts are being made to decouple, and even for engineering, education, and so on. So whatever little attempts were made earlier, say, first standard marks is carried and so on. So we not yet decoupled this time.
Yeah, so 10th actually, they had done away with the, I mean, give an option, right? CBSE had given an option, but now they are back into the board exam because of parents. I mean, parents all want the board exam, so they don't feel satisfied. Yeah, you had a question. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Yes.
That perspective, board exams are actually need to work.
Yes. Yes.
And the scaling up needs to happen by scaling down. What may be required if the spirit is to be carried forward, if you do away with national level, state level board, have more localized learning territory, where you are working. The problem is integration of the higher learning education.
Yes.
I think that's that part.
Yes.
And that is what is dictating a lot of these
Yeah. True.
in our school education.
Yes.
Which is leading to relooking at the no-detention policy from a different lens.
Yes.
Rather than questioning exams which are centralized, like even the classroom for what is the
Yeah, and the coaching industry, which is taking up all of that. Yeah.
and effort, that relooking at the entire system of learning, which is constraining and leaves a lot of political
Will.
which is
Yeah. True. No, because yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Once I remember saying about higher education, how it was meant to be by the people in politics, now by the industry, for the industry, not the industry. Kind of driving the entire learning of
Rhythm. Yeah. Yeah.
I think I've always wondered. Strictly speaking, as a teacher, my job is not to learn. My job is to teach. I can do whatever evaluation I need to do to make the
That sounds good to me as a teacher, but there's an argument. Okay. Yeah.
Thing is, historically, I don't think it was the places where the learning was being offered. It was not they who were evaluated. Because see, honestly, when I conduct a test for an exam in my board, I have no clue what I'm testing them for. Right? Because I have no idea what role they're going to be playing in the industry after the exam. Right? I have nothing. I'm doing some evaluation based on some fancy notion that I have. So ideally, it should be the employer who should be testing and recruiting them depending on whether they are fit for the job they are planning to put them into. It shouldn't be the job of the university to assess or the center of learning to assess. It should be the job of the employer to assess whether they are fit for their job. And I think that's how it was historically. I don't know when this happened.
Okay. Yeah. So there's a strong philosophical argument for evaluation because that any educational process has intentions. That there is it's an intentional endeavor. Now we have.
Yeah, but then I don't give a big act, right? I mean,
Yeah. 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 Yeah, everyone's talking. Okay. Right. Yeah. 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 So.
Exactly. Why should I be doing it? It's their job to evaluate and take over. They think they're fit for their job. Maybe they're fit for somebody else. They will pick them up. I shouldn't be doing a steamroll evaluation. I have no idea what I'm evaluating them for. Really.
Okay.
To take so many more exams, right?
The basic question is, can we instead of evaluation,
Yeah.
still ensure that outcomes are met?
Yes.
But there is no evaluation.
No, but how do you ensure outcomes are met?
Is it possible to do it in elementary stage?
Yeah. So but how does one? Yeah. 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 No, both ways. So, how do you ensure that the outcomes are being met? Yeah.
Be able to read in two languages and do some simple
Basic, yeah, literacy,
5
numeracy.
years of education. If you can do this, you are done.
Yes. Yes.
In 5 years, you don't have to conduct 25 exams, 50 exams to ensure that such a thing happens, right?
Yeah.
Something else that you can do just that this objective is fine.
But it is a continuous process. That is, so, and early intervention always helps, to be able to diagnose, remedial, to be able to take some action. So I know, but there may be different views on this. But yeah, okay. But I don't think we finished. Probably we'll take it out. Yeah, okay. Okay, thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.